This is the first non BioTools Innovator topic we've had. So I'm excited to introduce today Brian Poltelev, who's been involved in BioTools Innovator for a long time. And also we have Edward Graham Brown. So I'm going to turn it over to them and let them do a quick introduction for themselves, and we'll dive right into it. Brian, would you like to go first?
Sure, happy to. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces and nice to talk about a topic that's pretty close to my heart in terms of pricing. I'm Brian Poltolov, and as Jim said, I've been engaged with BTI since its inception, I guess, what 4 years ago or so. I been in the industry for a couple decades, spent 12 years with Thermo Fisher in product management, business leadership, general management roles. 3 years as an operating partner with Broad Oak Capital, a sponsor of BioTools Innovator. And for the last 12 months or so, I've been doing freelance consulting, advisory work, and commercialization strategy, and fundraising and strategic partnerships. So nice to speak with everybody. Nice to see everybody, and look forward to talking more about pricing.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And Edward.
Thank you, Jim. My name is Edward Graham Brown, and like Brian, I've also been in the industry for a number of years, perhaps more than I care to mention. I started off in the life science tools supply business, actually in Japan in the late 90s, and then moved from there to the woods in Sweden, Uppsala. Took my family from Tokyo to Uppsala, and I was working for the then Amersham Pharmacia Biotech, which was a previous iteration of what we now know as Cytiva. They had their manufacturing plant there, BioTools, for purification of a number of different types of biomolecules. I moved to the States in 2005, worked for Millipore Corporation as the head of the filtration business for a couple of years, and then in the life sciences area. And then after that, moved into strategic marketing, and had spent the last 8.5 years at Fujifilm Irvine Scientific out in Orange County on the West Coast. I'm based in the Boston area, and since the beginning of this year, I have been doing consulting and established a consulting firm as well, particularly focusing on marketing, strategy, and business development. Very nice to meet you, and likewise, pricing is close to my heart.
Thanks, Edward. And just some ground rules. So if you're watching right now on LinkedIn, feel free to submit questions on there. We'll be watching and looking for those. If you're here on the Zoom, please use the Q&A panel to ask questions. We won't be monitoring the chat function for that. And the format here is a 1 hour format of a live stream. So we're going to be talking about pricing strategy, and then after an hour's up, we'll go into a private discussion with the cohort. So I just want to kind of kick it off because pricing strategy sounds simple because it's a short set of words, but it actually is a pretty complicated topic, and it's a pretty nuanced topic. And so, kind of just kick this off, Brian, I'll kind of let you start, but how does pricing strategy integrate into, business model thinking, planning, and how do you sort of approach pricing strategy with a business?
Sure. Well, when I think about business models broadly speaking, I think about them in terms of value creation and value capture. And obviously, the pricing model obviously clearly affects value capture. And do you want to take a skimming approach? Do you where you're just recognizing a little bit of the value you're creating? Do you want to really look at a margin, margin maximization approach to try to, do you want penetration, or are you really trying to drive margin expansion and so forth? So there's some different conceptual thinkings there around that. Of course, we can get into a little bit more around discounting and models and so forth. But actually, pricing actually affects value creation as well. Not necessarily in terms of the absolute amount of creation, but the perception around value creation. And so we'll talk as well around how you can use pricing to actually influence the perceived amount of value that you're creating, and then consequently how you're trying to capture a slice of that, and also deliver some of that back to customers to drive their incentive to use your products and services that much more. So, I mean, at a high level, I would say it is fundamental towards your business model. And actually, I would tell you, I used to tell my team all the time when I was in industry that dollar per hour, there's nothing I do that makes more money for the company than pricing. It's not the sexiest. It's not what I want to talk to customers about, and so forth, right? It's not doesn't inspire as much as innovation and really, impacting patients and so forth. But in terms of an ROI on my time as a product manager, as a business leader, getting pricing right is so critical, and frankly, done either not well or frankly just not done much at all. It's just kind of an afterthought. And it takes relatively a little minimal amount of effort, but can make a huge impact on the success of and the financial results. So
Yeah, that's great points. And I think especially you talked about some of your experience at big companies, but I think for small companies, it can mean the difference between multipliers on an exit. It can be the difference between, being able to close that next round, and be able to sort of get the funding you need to do to maybe not raise as much or to get to the next level. So yeah, totally agree. Edward, do you have anything to add to that, or do you have a different take on it?
I agree with everything that Brian said. I actually put together two or three slides which I thought might be useful to share, because I'm not quite sure what the baseline understanding of different aspects of pricing are concerned. One of the things that would you mind if I shared that with the group?
Yeah, go for it. I think you've got access to share your screen.
Yes. So can you see uh,
Yeah.
what
Yep.
okay, all right. So I'm just going to run through this. I've already made an introduction. By the way, the name of my newly established firm is called Rossa Penna, and that is actually a place where my mother was born. So that's the only other than that, it's beautiful, and it's got a lot of golf courses nearby. I've already been through this. I was at Millipore, GE Healthcare, and Fujifilm, and so I'm going to move on to what are we talking about in terms of pricing and its impact as a profit driver. I think one of the key words here is variation. So a 1% variation in price results in a profit change for the better or for the worse of 11%. In fact, this is based on one of the seminal articles that was written on pricing by two authors that published in the Harvard Business Review nearly 32 years ago in 1992, and it hasn't changed since then. The numbers are perhaps slightly different depending on the cohort of companies that you use. This is across a bunch of different industries, but pricing is the strongest driver. If you make a 1% variation in variable cost, it's an 8% change in operating profit. Sales volume would account for a 3.3% change, according to this article, and fixed costs only just over 2%. So that means when I say variation, if you increase your price, your net price by 1%, you get a positive uplift, one of the strongest drivers on the operating line. But if you decrease it by 1%, it's a double-edged sword. So that's one thing, just to level set the importance of price. And I don't know whether you're familiar with this idea, but it's in the article. Obviously, people are familiar with the idea that you have a list price and then you have negotiated discounts. And then that leads to an invoice price, and those discounts may appear on the invoice. What people are less familiar with is the impact of off-invoice parameters and how they erode price. So you may have discounts if you pay in cash, if you agree to attractive payment terms to the vendor, let's say net 30 days or even faster. You may have freight that is given away, rebates, and then you eventually get to your what is referred to as in the pricing industry as a pocket price. And that's just on the price. But then when you get down to the margin, there is a further waterfall. But an example here could be you have a product that sells for $250 and the invoice price is $205, which is 18% off list. And then you have these subsequent discount effects or subsequent erosion effects, such as freight rebates, off invoice promotions, and that will take your actual price down to $160 in this example, which is a $90 discount from the original list price. So understanding what those areas are is very important. Getting from the pocket price to the pocket margin is also has certain costs, and these can be calculated based on customer-driven behavior, such as technical support, specific from either over the phone or from personnel in the field. There could be specific R&D costs. There could be an inaccurate forecast that is provided by a customer that results in an inventory build, and then you have specific capacity related costs. All of this affects the overall pocket margin. Now, this is different to a normal P&L because we're not talking about sales volumes in aggregate. We're getting very granular here and trying to understand the impact of what is the profitability of a particular customer versus another. And I've sanitized some data here, and I've hidden the names of the customers, but this is an example, a real world example of what that type of analysis can reveal. So you can start off with a bunch of customers. They have different overall sales volumes, and you look at the sales volumes over let's say a period of 1 year, and you will end up with very different pocket prices as percentages of the list price and very different pocket margins. And this type of assessment can be very helpful to a company to understand, for example, why is it that customer A and customer C, for example, have much lower pocket margins than customer H or customer F. The pocket margin of customer H is 75%, whereas for A and C in particular, it's a high volume account. In this case, I've got it at almost 22 million in sales. And the reason for this then needs to be investigated to get further insights. What was it about that account that resulted in such a low pocket price and then a pocket margin? And in this case, it's due to a discounting history, closeness to the headquarters, professional pricing or purchasing managers at the account, and also product specific or product mix effects. The product mix or the standard production costs for the particular product being used at customer C was very different to the one at customer H. So these sort of things are very enlightening for companies to understand why certain accounts are, when you categorize accounts, I'm talking customer accounts here, whether they should be truly strategic accounts or not. And this leads to something which I think we're going to discuss, which is the types of agreements that you have with your customers. Transactional based agreement or transactional based discounting is, of course, the obvious thing to think about. You have a product, you want to, you take a cost plus approach to pricing. You have an invoice with a negotiated discount, make the transaction, and then move on to the next. But a lot of the companies that myself and Brian have worked for over the years have moved from that type of model for very good reasons to a global price agreement, and then later a strategic supplier agreement. And this then takes into account a number of things that are important in the relationship between the BioTools supplier and the customer account. And we saw a lot of this happening in COVID as well. But also it provides an opportunity for a BioTools supplier to really understand what are those price negotiation levers that should be put on the table when you're having a discussion about pricing, and to negotiate from a point of view of understanding your business, understanding what are the things that you would like to charge for, and things that that you didn't charge for in the past that you may wish to charge for now, or vice versa, recognizing that you've got a volume discount based approach that isn't working, and you don't have harmonization across geographies or regions or globally. So these sort of things are really important. Those are just the 2 or 3 topics that I wanted to sort of like put up as a starting point for discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Edward. That was really interesting. I appreciate the numbers, and I don't know, watching the waterfall, I was getting a little hot. I was like, oh man, I don't like this waterfall. Um, but it's important because those are, you get into that when you pull all the levers. So it's great to be able to think about that. Um, I think, one thing I take away from this as well is, and we'll get into this, but the pricing strategy looks like it's going to change over time, and it's going to kind of depend where the company is at their stage of development in the market, what the right strategy is for them. And so Brian, I want to kick it back to you. In terms of a company, and especially in our BioTools cohort, we've got people who are just entering the market, and some people who have been in the market for a little while. But as a CEO and a founder, when is the right time to start thinking about and defining the pricing strategy for your product?
I think you start to think about it when you're building your business model for your, I'll stick with products, since I think most of the BTI community is product oriented, but frankly, a lot of the same logic applies for service. But as you start to think about your business model, as you start to think about, your financial model and so forth, you walk in with an assumption around pricing. And of course, you're going to refine that. And we can talk about that. But I mean, I think it really, at a high level, it starts from the beginning. But that's really more around, you do a little initial benchmarking, you put some assumptions out there about what you want to think. You probably aren't giving a ton of quantitative thought. Probably shouldn't be, frankly, at that point. But as you go through the development of your offering, as you start to get it in customers' hands, do testing, as you kind of start to look at how much money you're either saving for them, creating for them, what's the value that you're doing, and we can talk a little bit more about methods for doing that. Then you start to think more sophisticated around what's the distribution of different customers for different applications? How does, the experience and the value look different for these different segments? And then you start to think more about how much, how compelling is your offering to which segments, and then how much value do you really want to create? And then, so I think, and then as you really start to kind of lock into your design and start to think about your commercialization plan and how you're going to go to market, then you're also really getting much more quantitative around where you want to set a list price, how you want to think about discounting and discounting strategies. What are the different components, right? You might have just generally said, we're going to assume that we're going to capture $100 from every single customer. But if you have an instrument and then a consumable, how do you want to think about that differently? Or if there's a software and a licensing fee or support package, you start to think about the different elements and components around what that looks like and the lifetime value, and you get a little more granular around that. So I would say, broadly speaking, you start in the beginning, but then you get a lot more sophisticated and a lot more quantitative as you progress. I guess the last thing I would say is that as you're thinking about putting a product out there or an offering out there, you really got to think through when you want to, how public do you want to go around with that pricing too, because on one hand, you might get clarity from customers and so forth, but you also, it also sometimes limits your ability to, right, to make substantial changes later. And you have to think through a little bit of that strategy as well.
Right. So, Edward, to build on that, if you're a company trying to think about getting into this, can you kind of lay out some experiences or some roadmaps that companies can follow? I mean, when you're approaching this to kind of optimize your pricing, do you need to look at market research? What sort of process and levers do you go through to sort of put together your first pass at a pricing strategy?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, thank you. I also, I mean, if it's a product-based company, then my thinking is it's very early stage that you start having those discussions, probably around the point in time where you're not even before you got to the design specifications, but it's sort of like a product strategy discussion as well. And so having an understanding of what the economic benefit of the product will be. And as far as roadmaps are concerned, marketing research, yes, I've done that. I've used a variety of different types of software because I think there's a default line of thinking, and that is, you look at your costs, you try to go for a target margin. What is your acceptable margin for a product? This is what a lot of companies do. But in reality, the better way to do this is to really try to determine what is the value that you're providing through the product or the service, and then to try and quantify that. And of course, that is not easy to do, but there are ways in which it can be done, where you can determine through a consultative approach with a customer what are the parameters or what are the specific values of a product that are appreciated and prioritized, and what are they relative to each other, and importantly, how are they relative to price. If you're in the market for buying a wristwatch, for example, you probably know what your budget is, but there are certain things that you might wish to have. Is accuracy the most important thing, or is it more to do with the actual mechanics, the servicing, these sort of things? So there are, as far as my own experience, of course, I have experience with downstream products in chromatography, in filtration, and then upstream in cell culture media and bio tools that are used for anything from trying to determine the gene of interest assays through to the bioreactor. And a lot of the discussions about pricing, I think you have to determine, whether or not the product you are developing, how well differentiated it is, what are what are the comparables on the market, or if you understand what your competitors are working on. There are, I mean, this comes to a point that Brian touched on, which is competitive pricing, understanding that, and not just the list prices, but the achieved prices in the market, and what those achieved prices would mean in terms of product margins. Now, a smaller company doesn't necessarily have the benefit of economies of scale as a company like Thermo Fisher, and might not have some of the processes in place, but they could have a very, very enabling technology, and that technology may have value, and it's really determining what that value is through direct consultation with customers. So market research is important, and this type of work needs to be done through, as I said, sort of talking with customers to understand what their trade-offs are. Some customers will tell you we need this, this, and this, but ultimately it may be just one feature or benefit of the product that has the overriding economic impact for them. Getting to an understanding of value and then charging on the basis of that would be a better approach than taking the cost plus approach.
So let me actually just unpack that a bit more. Edward, I agree with everything you just said, especially around value-based pricing. But let's just talk a little more pragmatically. I want to get a little more tactically about how you might implement that. From a market research report, from a market research approach standpoint, my experience is, first of all, direct asking people, how much is this worth to you? $100, $200, $500, or whatever, is not helpful at all. Obviously people always say, oh, well, I want to pay less, but also just people don't know and they can't answer that. If you wanted to take a sophisticated market research approach, then you would use some sort of a indirect method, like an adaptive conjoint type survey, where people are trading off different options, right? So you say, okay, which do you like better? A car that has great handling, it's red, it goes 0 to 60 2.2 miles or 2.2 seconds, and it costs $50,000, or do you prefer a car that has more storage space, et cetera, and goes 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds or whatever, and costs $73,000? And then they say, okay, I like car A, and then they look the same thing, okay, I like option B better, and they go through that same process 50 times. You guys have probably seen these before, and you aggregate those using a statistical method, and you can actually come up with product specifications, and you can actually come up with an implied price. So there's certainly an established method for market research if you want to go down that path. My guess is most of the companies in the cohort, and frankly, most companies that are out there broadly, don't go through that. I do think that it can be very effective. I think it can, it could be $25,000, $50,000 that you spend, and it actually is really helpful in terms of product specifications and so forth. Sometimes, you have that, you want to make that type of investment. It really does require you to have, though, a sufficient number of people. And if you're selling to kind of an academic research market, you might be able to do that. But if you're trying to sell into a much more niche area, it might be hard to really get the right folks to answer that kind of question and to get any kind of significance. So I do think that that could be difficult. But it is very effective. If to take a value-based approach, as Edward was saying, think about the different customer segments, think about the applications, map out what they would actually consume in terms of dollars that they would have to spend, capital and reagents and disposables and so forth, if they weren't using yours. Think about the soft costs as well in terms of elapsed time and labor, et cetera. and start to model out for different applications or different customer segments what that might look like, depending on if they're using competition A, competition B, and competition C. Not always so easy. As Edward said, you got to look at, kind of what they're actually paying or what you believe they're probably actually paying on the marketplace as opposed to lists. But then you can actually say, okay, what are they getting out of me, and is it greater yield? So you might need to think about, is it a cost savings, or are they kind of spending the same or even more, but they're getting a lot more kind of value that you're creating? And then how do you bring that down into a amount that you are an incremental value that you're creating? And then if you said you ultimately come up with the fact that every time they use the product, or every ounce of cells they create, or protein there, or mRNA, or whatever, they're creating, X amount of value, and then deciding, you set a pricing such that, maybe some percentage of that is you're giving to them, and some percentage of that you're kind of taking. And that's your skimming versus your margin type strategy. Typically, what I've seen is that for a smaller company without a lot of name recognition, brand recognition, you're trying to actually create a good bit of value and give a lot of value back to them to make a compelling story. So if you decided that, if you did your analysis, and for your target customer segment, you're creating $100 of quote unquote value, then maybe you want to only charge 20, 25, $30 and give them back $70, $80 worth of implied value. And then you can use that to try to hopefully convince customers, especially early on, to adopt the product and think about your setting your pricing accordingly. So that's, obviously, devil's in the details, but a little bit more how I think about actually bringing some of these types of concepts into fruition, as you think about launching.
I would agree with that. I think based on, so for certain product lines that I've managed or I've had responsibility for in the past, I have actually used that adaptive conjoint analytical software, and I found that but it's the same with a lot of these things. It depends on the number of customers that you talk to. It does come down to statistics in the end. That has been quite useful to be able to set different price points for different types of products. But again, it's for a company that already has established products on the market. The approach that you have described, Brian, about price skimming versus penetration, I think it's or market penetration. I think that is also well said there. The smaller companies certainly want to provide more value at the front end in order to penetrate the market, to get adoption of the technology. So it does make sense, and I think it's true that there are different approaches that can be taken. For the reason I went through the price waterfall analysis was because it's clear that not all customers are the same, and some customers can certainly take advantage of smaller customers and ask for smaller suppliers and ask for greater and greater discounts, and that's not in the interest of this audience. You want to be able to gain price wherever you can, and do that in a systematic way.
Thanks, guys. So I think when I think about this and talk to founders and things like that, especially if they don't have a lot of background in business or pricing, the most common model people come to is, commodity-based pricing. Like, here's my fixed cost plus pricing. It cost me $50 to do this, so I'm going to charge 75. I think, from my perspective as a person building a new company, you're not building a commodity. So it's probably one of the worst models you could choose as a founder. But can I hear from you guys kind of what are your thoughts in terms of strategies that work? What have you sort of seen? Do you have any sort of case studies you've seen companies go through where it's gone really well, or maybe the opposite?
Yeah, so totally agree. It's I don't know if it's the worst model. I guess if it cost you $50, it'd be probably worse if you charge 25. But certainly a cost plus margin is not the way to go. A value-based pricing where you're trying to assess the, I mean, at a minimum, if you just want to take a very crude level, look at the competition, look at where they're pricing, and think about how do you want people, the audience, the customer base, the market to see your product relative to the competition. And so if nothing else, if you want to take a very simple method, just think about benchmarking. And if you look at the competition and they're priced here, then think about if you want to, where you want to set your pricing relative to them. And at least it'll be somewhat market-based. It won't be optimized, but it's a lot better than anything based on your costs. Your costs are really just a back check to make sure that you are making a sufficient margin. But that should be kind of, just at the end, not in the beginning. I have an interesting case study I'll share with you on the signaling value and so forth. It's actually not my case study. It's another. It's an old HBR article. I'm not sure it's quite as old, Edward, as the one you mentioned before, but it looked at fair trade coffee and organic lettuce. It was actually in the UK, and it looked at 500 stores or whatever. And basically, they looked at the premium that you're getting for fair trade coffee over conventional or organic lettuce over conventional. And there was actually, in this study, they tested two different price points. And I think one was like a 30% premium and one was a 70% premium. And they looked at customer behavior and activity in the supermarkets, with those two different pricing levels set. And I don't think anybody here will be surprised to hear that profit margins were higher when you set 70% versus if you just charge a 30% premium. What was interesting to me, though, was actually the relative volume that you sold of the premium products was higher when they charged 70% premiums versus a 30% premium. So put differently, when customers saw the organic lettuce at a 70% premium over the conventional lettuce, not only were they willing to pay more, but more of them a higher percentage bought the organic lettuce. And the same was true for the coffee, which was, I think, a little bit counterintuitive to what we think about, the pricing elasticity and so forth. And so really, I think that comes back to some of the signaling bit that I recommend or that I was referencing before. And as you think about looking at where the competition is pricing and recognizing there's probably some discounting and so forth, but when you look at that, thinking about where you're pricing and how you want to position your offering as in comparison to the alternatives. Now, a lot of times there's not perfect substitutes. You're not in a grocery market, the grocery store, et cetera, right? It's not quite as cut and dry and clear, and you may or may not have access to the store shelves, if you will, but that's the model and the mindset that I would encourage you to think about as you're going about this. I guess the last point I'll just make around this is just also recognize that the entire market, the entire customer base is probably not really necessarily as relevant as the target applications that you're going after. And so really making sure that you're honed in and thinking about the appropriate alternatives and that relative value for the target market segment, and get really specific around that target market segment that you're focusing on, as opposed to the entire addressable market, which you'll also hopefully pull through a little bit of revenue from, but it's not necessarily where you're really trying to get the most amount of value maximization.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. So if I was a small company in our cohort and I'm trying to get my sort of first products to market and I'm trying to optimize my pricing, would you guys recommend any strategies? Should I, would I pick out like 3 target customers and maybe offer different pricing to each of them to see sort of how they respond and react to that? Or, it's great when you got lots of data and lots of stores, but
Of
when you don't
course.
have that, what are some things you can do, or would you suggest to sort of get that out of the gate process started?
So even for a big company, by the way, a lot of times the most impact you have is with a new product and a new product launch. That's where you can make the biggest impact. So you don't have a lot of data there anyways. So it's a little more similar than you think. But I guess what I would say is, first of all, you kind of want to, when you're doing, I recommend almost everybody should be doing beta testing work. A big company, small company, it doesn't matter. That's a good process to go through. And you don't need to be, or whatever you're setting the price point at the beta testing, I would, you're not publishing that to the world. And I wouldn't, it's a baseline, it's a little bit of a data point and so forth, but you shouldn't be worried about it. Even if you're selling your beta test customers or whatever, I wouldn't be worried about that. When you are thinking about launching, especially if you're doing an early launch or a pre-launch, I totally recommend pricing pilots, as you just mentioned. I think you need to, you can't go to 3 customers and use 3 different price points. You probably need to go to 30 customers and use 3 different price points, across those to look at a little different groups, because obviously different individuals and scenarios are going to have different. But I think it's definitely worth it to invest in that. And if you want to put pricing out there, but you still want to test that, you could set it with just put a higher price on, kind of higher list price, and then use it to test maybe a 10% discount limit versus a 20% versus a 50% for some different, and then that way you can effectively test different thresholds, and ultimately you can make an adjustment on price if you want, list price if you want to, or just ultimately set however you want to handle discounting in the future. And you might have some legacy customers who are quote unquote at the wrong price and locked in at the wrong price. You can live with that. It's not that big of a deal, because you're not worried about the first 1 or 2 customers. You're worried about, the maximization over the longer tail. So I do think there's ways to do that and ways to look at that. But I think that that will help you to see that trade-off in what they're perceived in terms of value, and ultimately how much adoption you get from your products or service.
Ed, or doing that.
Yeah, I wanted to just quickly touch on the previous question and then answer this question too. The previous question about commodities or commodity-based pricing. Believe me, you don't want to get into that world at all. I mean, I've been through the experience when I was working in Uppsala many years ago. There was a small product line that was subject to, or actually became commoditized. You cannot come back from that. It's such a difficult world of pain, and it's something that should be avoided. Now, as far as small companies going out and trying to determine what is the price point, what I would recommend is, and I know it sounds very basic, but it's going to a customer very much in listening mode, trying to understand not just what is the problem or the gap that you're selling to, where the value lies, but also what it means for them, and trying to get some sense as to what the impact of your product or offering can have on their day-to-day life. I'll give you an example with a chromatography media that had a very expensive wash agent. And when I say wash agent, I mean when you're trying to regenerate the media, it takes it was an expensive reagent that was being used. A new product was developed by one of my former employers that circumvented that avoided the need for the expensive reagent. Therefore, the discussion was really around what does this mean in terms of process economics? How much savings could you achieve if you were to use this product? And then that leads to that value-based pricing discussion. At least you have that discussion with customers that have similar problems, and then you understand how you can potentially charge. Now, everything that Brian said about the approach to discounting and setting list prices, I agree with that. Obviously the problem is sometimes that you see companies that have list prices that are very, very or wildly different from actual achieved prices. So you want to make sure that the list price is somehow related, but it shouldn't be 80% off. That just means you've got the initial price wrong. But I do think through consultation, having these discussions with customers, understanding not just what the product is, what it does, but what it means, both in terms of emotional value, economic value, whatever it might be, is the starting point. Having those conversations and just approaching the customers more as partners rather than transaction parties.
Right. Okay. Well, that's great. I want to move on to sort of customer segmentation and sort of tying that in with sort of pricing transparency and uniformity, because I think there's a lot of questions around, should we have our prices publicly posted or should they be not publicly posted? Um, if you're a software, oftentimes there's a publicly, like, trial, not trial, but an individual basis, or some smaller package, but then enterprise is still sort of hidden behind the negotiation wall. But uh, in terms of that, do you guys have any thoughts of sort of challenges or pros or cons of sort of publicly putting your pricing out there? And then if you do that, how do you sort of deal with your different segments of academic, enterprise, larger partners, things like that?
Well, I mean, in answer to your question around public versus not, I mean, I think you have to look at your customer base and how diffuse it is or how diverse it is, right? And obviously to put a public price out there creates a little bit of transparency and probably reduces the amount of pain for a customer in the purchasing process. So we like that aspect. If the applications are wildly different, if you think you want to charge way different for this customer segment versus that customer segment, then you probably want to do that. But if you're only talking about a 10% premium or 15% difference or something like that, it might just be worth it not to even not to just to put it out there and maybe to manage that through discounting a little bit as opposed to holding it all back. I would say typically kind of putting out there prices that are for general application, maybe that's for research use, but it's not for the therapeutic commercial manufacturing, other ways, in your limited use license to make it so that way you're holding back, as you just said, kind of like the enterprise license is a little bit TBD, because if you're selling to a large biopharma versus a small biotech, you want to make that a little different, but user by user, maybe you make that public. So I think that generally speaking, public availability for a base level where you're going to have a much more consistent customer base. Maybe it's, as I said, not for commercial use. I think there's a lot of value in that, and I would encourage that at the right time. You don't necessarily have to do that immediately, but sooner versus later to kind of get there, I think would be is generally speaking best practice.
That's a great Sorry, it's a great point. Yeah, not commercial use. That helps kind of alleviate some of the commitments of putting the pricing out there in a bigger campaign, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree with what Brian just said. Obviously applications do have different value to the customer. I would say that the point's well taken. It depends on how diffuse or how well defined your customer base is. Obviously, customers need to budget for their own expenses too. So there is a strong argument for having some transparency. But if the value proposition is somewhat different, or for competitive reasons you don't want to tip your hand, then pricing can be disclosed at a later date. It really depends on the offering and depends on the application and the size and dynamics of the customer base, as Brian said.
Just two more points if I can hit, and a little more tactically as well, just to think about. First of all, in this industry and for these applications, I would say discounts, you almost never want to put discounts publicly out there, and you want to make sure that those are all customer specific and kind of confidential, if you will. Right, and it kind of goes without saying, but obviously, I mean, you go in a retail store, you could see a big sale, 10% off or whatever else, and that might work for Amazon or Walmart or whoever, but I wouldn't recommend that. Also, on the discounting part, We talk about, I said earlier, 10% discount, 20% discount, 50% discount, whatever the numbers are. All right. When you're negotiating a discount with a customer, especially if you're, as you're getting close to the actual number that you want them to lock into, the answer is never 10%. It is never 20%. It is never 15%. It is always a number like 9.83% or, 14.7%. Okay. Or 21%. But if you tell me you got a 20% discount, I know that's kind of a convenient round number. And so I can, as a customer, I know I can get at least a 22% or 23% discount. No question about that. So you always want to make sure as you get to a close to what you think is best and final, always make sure it's an arbitrarily round number. I don't care if you said 20. I don't care if you put 21 or 19. I mean, I do for that last 2%, of course, of price, as Edward was saying, that matters quite a bit. But the price point should always be kind of an awkward number, if you will.
Yeah.
And then the other comment I will make is that especially for reagents, disposables, instrumentation, services, and the like, almost anything but software, but maybe also including software, you might want to put pricing out there, as we said, publicly, but I wouldn't put out there a public price that is global because the market looks different in New York than it does in Berlin, than it does in Tokyo. And I guarantee you the competition's charging different price points in those areas, and the propensity to pay, currency effects, everything else. I don't care if maybe you're collecting all your dollars in US, maybe it's all in euros. I don't really care, but either your cost of business is different in those different regions, and or the perception of different prices is different in different regions. And so even if it's not that difficult with the web to make the number look different if you have a customer from a different country. Any decent web designer can help you do that with relatively ease. And you should always just think about different price points for at least the major regions in the world. You don't have to. I'm not so worried about what if you optimize for Morocco, but I certainly wouldn't want to charge the same for Japan and Germany.
I would add one other point, and that is just based on my experience that Pavlov is alive and well. So you have to be very careful about conditioning your customer base to, for example, Christmas-based discounts and what I mean by that is a lot of companies in the biotech supply have over the years tried to pull sales from one quarter to the preceding quarter. Customers get to understand that, and then they wait until a certain point in time or in the calendar to place an order. So you want to, if you do have campaigns, make sure that you think about it carefully and don't reinforce certain behaviors, so that you get lumpiness in your sales cycle.
Agreed.
Great.
Although I do think that's mostly a big company problem.
Yeah. Okay.
So we've got about 5 minutes before we wrap up the live stream here. So I just want to kind of reiterate, Brian, I think you hit on a really interesting point there about the non-round numbers on the discount. I would also push that to companies. I think, I think that same philosophy applies to your price. Don't have a simple $1,000 price. It should be like 1,015.43. It could be non-round numbers. I think anytime you do that, it makes it feel more real and calculated to the customer perspective. So the last question before we wrap up is kind of a situational, but we're all small companies. We're selling to a lot of really big companies that have even negotiating departments within them.
Yeah.
So if you're a small company trying to stand firm with your pricing or to make sure that you're not sort of discounted to irrelevance or to become a problem in your company, what are some strategies, negotiation strategies and tactics companies can do to reinforce their value, to hold the value in the price and to sort of push back on a customer that just says, oh, I want a 30% discount or a 20% discount, or I want negative 365 terms?
I think it's a lot of the old-fashioned stuff, and that is, making sure that you can provide commitments and honor those commitments. If you say that you can deliver a product by a certain date, make sure that that happens. There have been so many examples where bigger companies have fallen short in the basic nuts and bolts of doing business. A smaller company has a great advantage of being able to be agile, be able to provide personalized approaches to doing business with a customer. And there are certain things that can be very beneficial from the point of view of services that are not charged for, and providing those types of services or agreeing to do things that make a difference in the world and mind of the customers. Yes, you're right. There are a lot of professional purchasing agents out there, but those people are incentivized like everybody else. Try to understand what their incentives are. Is it that they want to get a certain percentage discount every year as part of their approach, or take the approach of not just having the relationship with the purchasing person at the account, but importantly, the technical decision maker, and trying to understand how, if there are other things that can be done to help them. And then to a certain extent, you're taking price out of the equation, or you're reducing the emphasis on price, and instead talking about the entire value proposition, which is another aspect of why people would buy from one firm versus another.
Let me just say, I would say two strategies that I've found successful here. Two strategies in 60 seconds. One is ask them for more. If I give you this discount, will you make a multi-year commitment? Will you increase your volumes? Will you do something else? Right? There's some trade-off there that if they are, aggregating it, will they increase their order or something else like that? That's one strategy. If you're at a big company, it's okay. Well, would you also buy this with it? You might not have this with it to also buy, but they might be able to increase the volume, multiple sites, or something like that, that you might be able to get them. The other strategy is ask for something that's non-monetary, but of value for you. So if I give you this greater discount, will you give me access to your data? Will you allow us to present that data? Will you present that data at this upcoming conference in 6 months, assuming it works out well? Which probably, frankly, matters more to you if they would get on stage at a credible customer with talking about your product than, the amount of dollars that you would get directly from that customer. So I think there's things that you can do that have potentially non-monetary impact for them that would actually create a ton more value for you. And if they say, no, I can't do that, no, I can't release this or something else like that, now it's a little easier to go back to, well, I gave you an option to be able to get your price point. Of course you can go back into, nuanced terms and so forth, but from my experience, changing from, net 45 to net 30 or whatever it is sometimes a lot harder for a lot of companies than it is to convince a scientist to get up on stage.
Yeah, so on price bundling is definitely a tactic that can be used to offset any pressure on a particular price point. If you have an opportunity to bundle product with service or product with with additional products, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I think we're at time, but I'm going to take one more minute and just I do want to get this last question before we turn off the feed, which is, what are some of the common mistakes you see early stage companies make in regards to their pricing strategy? And try to keep the answers within a minute, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on kind of what you've seen and some of the mistakes you've seen people make along the way. Don't name any names, but
Well, Jim, we can talk about your company and specifically.
Hey, no names.
There you go. No, I would say Edward mentioned cost plus, and I think way too often that is the single biggest one. And if you are, by the way, if you're doing it, it's wrong. If you're talking to a potential investor or somebody else and talking with them about your business model and you're explaining to them how you arrived at your why pricing and it's based on this, target margin that we have, it's wrong. So I would say that's the number one issue that we see, or that I see broadly. I know we talked about it before. I think the other is that we just don't spend enough time focused on this. We spend I think I mentioned in the beginning, dollar per hour, there's nothing you do. It takes you thousands and your team thousands of hours to develop a product and get the technology right and do the marketing and do the website and whatever else it is and go out and try to sell it, etc. It takes you, tens of hours to get the right price. Invest that
Yeah.
time, it will pay off in gold.
Yeah. I would say, Jim, that pricing is not it shouldn't be considered a difficult subject or something that should be shied away from. Of course, there are numbers involved, and not everybody is comfortable with, for example, trying to talk to their accounting or someone that's doing their accounts and get information about how much it costs to serve a customer. There are lots of different things like that. So I think it's an understanding of pricing is a starting point, understanding price management. But I also think that it's one of those topics where you kind of leave it to specialists, but it should be something that everyone really understands, and it should become part of the DNA. I think there are many examples of people getting the price wrong. I think I've said that to you before, Jim, that when you've got it wrong, you don't know when you've got it right. So there is art and science to it. The model, of course, as Brian said, is important, getting that right. And understanding, I think, basically, when you're leaving money on the table, and understanding the value of your product beyond what it is meant to do. So like the next step in the workflow, the previous step in the workflow, how does your product change that? So think of things more holistically when you're setting prices.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. We're at time.